Part 4, Chapter 22 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, French Protestantism. From the revocation of the Edict of Nantes down to the beginning of the 18th century, the French Protestants led a miserable existence. The exiles and deaths had so weakened them that, of all parts of the Protestant world, this was the most hopeless. In all the largely populated portions of France, the Protestants were treated as an inferior race. The oppression was worthy of the Roman emperors in the age of persecution. The only part of the country where the old Huguenot spirit dared to assert itself was in the southeast, where the mountains of the Cevennes afforded some slight protection against the oppressor. The Camisards led in this reassertion of the old Huguenot spirit. They were a body of Protestants who were determined to regain their old rights. They were brave soldiers when fighting was necessary, but, when preaching and praying were the order of the day, they were as fearless and devoted as the English Puritans in the time of the Brownists. It is not strange that they should have been superstitious and fanatical, and should have seen visions and dreamed dreams. The oppressed have always imagined that the veil between them and the supernatural was very thin, and often entirely removed. So long as the Camisards were obscure, and their movements confined to a local uprising, they were safe. But it was clear that they were kindling the old Huguenot fire in other parts of France. Besides, the dispersed French colonies in London and various parts of Germany showed intense sympathy with their kinsmen at home, and the entire movement was attracting general attention and assuming a European character. The alarm at the French court was great. Louis XIV. Determined to crush the Camisard uprising at all hazards. He sent soldiers to the Cevennes, who hunted down the Camisards as if they were wild beasts. The brave Protestants resisted with desperate heroism, and seemed to have no fear of death. So violent was the war, and so great the number of Louis XIV.'s soldiers, that the Camisards fell hopelessly beneath the sword of the oppressor. They were well nigh exterminated, and when the dragoons returned to Paris, it appeared that, once more, the Protestantism of France was finally crushed. A Protestant tradesman, John Calas, with his family, was the subject of a relentless local persecution. His son, in a fit of melancholy, had committed suicide, and his death was charged on the father, on the pretext that the young man was about to embrace the Roman Catholic religion. The passions of the people became aroused, and the Parliament of Toulouse, after an investigation, condemned Calas to death, 1672. He committed no political offense, was devoted to his work as a merchant of small wares, and yet he was persecuted with as much violence as though a traitor to France. It was a case of unmitigated cruelty. The simplicity and purity of the man did not save him from bitter severity. But John Calas and his family became familiar names throughout Europe. It was a case where innocence cried to heaven for justice. When the cry was heard, every court in Europe became familiar with the act of cruelty. The whole Protestant world declared against the crime. After the protests of Voltaire and others, the Paris Parliament took up the case and completely overturned the decisions of the Tribunal of Toulouse, declared Calas innocent, restored the property to the widow, but did not punish the infamous instigators and unjust judges of this horrible miscarriage of justice. The hostility of Voltaire to Christianity is the predominant factor in his career, but we cannot forget his efforts on behalf of toleration. When the 18th century opened, there was no one to speak a strong word for liberty. Europe lay prostrate in a despotism almost universal. It was the darkest period in modern history since the dawn of the Reformation. The divine right of kings was the charm which excused every oppression. Protestantism in Europe was, on the one hand, divided by violent controversy, and, on the other, was indifferent and secular. The Anglican Church was thoroughly honeycombed by the worldly spirit. The French ruler, therefore, in persecuting the few struggling Protestants, was acting in harmony with the general temper of the times. Voltaire, the negative figure of his times in all religious matters, entered upon a crusade for liberty. His tract on "Tolerance" proclaimed the sufferings of Calas and his family, and proved a watchword of the century. It was a rebuke of the sword as an umpire in matters of conscience. There was not a throne which was not shaken by the little pamphlet. All classes were aroused to a sight of the galling chains in which the continent lay. A notable effect was seen in the changed policy of the French government. The Protestants were relieved of many of their disabilities, and were granted liberties for which they had fought in vain. The new order was now in progress. The tide was reversed, and every decade added, not only to the universal thirst for religious liberty, but to the possession of the great boon. End of chapter 22.